G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our show Pole Position with Guardian Australia and Essential Media. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal country and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded here, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As you will know, days and times do vary for the Australia Institute's webinars. So make sure you head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au to register for our upcoming ones. Tomorrow, we'll be talking to Independent Senator for South Australia, Rex Patrick, about keeping the bastards honest and other mechanisms for accountability in the Senate and elsewhere. It should be a good one. And just a few tips before we begin to help today run smoothly. If you hover the mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can type in questions for our panel, and you should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments on their questions as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder, even though Zoom gives you one now, that this discussion is being recorded and we put them up on australiainstitute.tv at the end of that. That's our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe there. So yes, welcome to Pole Position, our show where we unpack the big political issues and dive into the latest political polling trends with the fortnightly Guardian Essential Poll. I'm delighted to welcome back our regular panelist, Katharine Murphy, the political editor at Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, the executive director of Essential Media, and John Remington from Essential as well. This week's Essential Poll covers what I believe Essential calls 2PP plus, two-party preferred plus. So we'll get into a bit of that, and Pete will kind of explain why they do things a bit differently after the last election. And of course, today's Essential Poll results come amidst a bunch of bad poll results for the government, certainly not good ones. But before we dive into the numbers, Katharine, half the country is in lockdown. We've now added car porks to sports rorts in terms of government scandals. Once again, never a lack of news around. Can you tell us what's been happening in politics this week?
Yeah, sure. Yes, never a lack of news, that's right. And today's been particularly brisk. We've now got Adelaide in lockdown, Melbourne in lockdown, or an extension in Melbourne of lockdown today, and Sydney also continuing lockdown and high numbers of cases. So it really is, again, COVID front and centre in the news cycle, in the political news cycle and in the national news cycle. The Prime Minister has, over the last sort of 24 hours or so, relocated from Sydney to Canberra, where he's been defined an essential worker ahead of the resumption of Parliament, which, well, we'll see if Parliament resumes or not. But at this stage, Parliament is scheduled to resume at the beginning of August. So the PM's in the lodge, and I think has a limited freedom of movement to be within his suite and the cabinet room, but otherwise is out of the community, given that he's come from Sydney. So, yeah, like I say, COVID is really front and centre. Eb mentioned that the car parks, well, what would you call it? Imbroglio is probably a polite word, is continuing to sort of burble along too in the background. This is an audit that the Australian National Audit Office did, which excoriated yet another discretionary grants program, where the only process seems to have been federal MPs deciding where they might like car parks in their electorate, bowling up these proposals to senior players in the government and having those car parks funded, and in a development astonishing no one, these expenditures have not really delivered great value for money, or dealt with the sort of the congestion problems that afflict major cities. So that's certainly been around as well in the background, bubbling away. Labor's had a field day really with that report, and the government really hasn't got anything much compelling to say about it, frankly, given that it is what it is.
Hard for those things to kind of reach the top of the news, though, given all the lockdowns and cases. It's, yeah, COVID tends to overtake everything, doesn't it? But Pete, as we mentioned, news poll was out earlier this week, Essential out today. This week, we've got something a bit different because I don't think we've had your two-party preferred plus system we haven't had that since we moved pole position here from Australia at home. So just quickly, overall, what are the results show this week from Guardian Essential?
So are you going to share the screen there?
I will.
So while we're getting the numbers up, so the idea of two-party preferred plus was really dealing with one of the insights from the last election where the polls were seen to have given people a false lodestar of where the public was. And if people remember, it was consistently a two-party preferred that had Labor well ahead of 50%. The reality was Labor was never ahead of 50% because there's a cohort of voters that moves around, but as you can see from the grey line, makes up between 8 and 10% of the population at any one time who are undecided on where their vote lies. We thought it made sense to pull them out of the reporting so that we can get a clear view of where intended votes are, but also give voice to those that don't have a view at any one part of the political process. So if you think about it, traditionally those numbers, that 8% would be taken out and it would be replaced, and then those numbers would then, the sample of 100 would reconstitute without those 8% even being looked at. So effectively it was disenfranchising the disengaged, who in a system of compulsory voting actually determine the outcome of elections. So rather than saying that Labor's ahead, I don't know if it'd be 52 or 51, 48, 49 at this stage of the cycle, what we say is there are more people at this stage saying that they would intend to vote Labor than coalition, but with the undecideds, it's still up in the air, which is kind of what's true. And things do shift around in election campaigns when those last cohort re-engage. And so we think this gives us a fair review. I think what's really interesting looking at this, Ev and Katharine, is that despite the long-term sense that people were happy with the way the federal government was handling the pandemic, the declared 2PP plus has sort of had Labor either at parity or slightly ahead the whole way through. And I think it tells me two things. One is that the discourse around the handling of the pandemic kind of became departisanized, if that's a word, in that it wasn't about the political brands last year, it was about government doing a particular job. I think that's starting to break, but that's a different story. So you can see, and I think it also explains why, for all the approval of federal government handling, there hasn't been widespread angst within Labor, because they would have been getting these numbers as well. They see them because we put these out publicly. They also do their own polling, and they know that it's not this kind of mad 60-40 golf that you'd have believe if you just looked at approval of handling of the pandemic. So, you know, I like to say last year, I think government at both federal and state levels won our support, but they have not yet won our vote for what comes next. And I think these numbers bear that out.
Yeah. Katharine, is there anything you kind of wanted to add to that, given the other, I guess, polls and things that have been around this week?
Yeah, just on the methodology first, just because this sort of change has been very important to both Pete and to me. Expressing these numbers in this way with the undecideds highlighted does create, from a reporter's perspective, as Pete mentioned, a more realistic snapshot of what's going on, i.e. that there is a cohort of voters in the country and a cohort that decides the outcome of elections that are on the fence until they walk into the polling booth. So expressing it in this fashion was something that Pete wanted to do as a consequence of reviewing what went wrong with polling prior to the last election. But from me, from a reporter's perspective, it's a discipline that is imposed on me, to a self-discipline, to express these polling trends more accurately. So that's I just want to sort of reinforce that for people watching who this 2PP plus is a new concept. It's an effort by Pete and myself to highlight or dial up the level of uncertainty in any poll trend. So that's why we've done it. And that's why we express it in this way. In terms of that trend, though, as Pete says, it shows that Labor federally has been competitive with the confidence dividend that the government banked last year has not yet switched to voting intention. And that's been evident in the polls for quite some period of time, and is particularly evident. I mean, what's of most interest to me in this poll, in this particular fortnightly poll, is that it allows us to tell a story from March to July in terms of the government's standing, in terms of how people are responding, I suppose, to perceptions that a government that handled the pandemic competently last year is not handling the pandemic competently this year.
Yeah,
see that across a range of measures. And as you said, Eb, it's sort of our poll's giving a similar picture to other polls that have been in the field. News Poll obviously reported this week. The Australia Institute had its own poll recently, which was examining or perceptions of federal state, confidence in the pandemic as well. So, I mean, the field data is sort of giving us a consistent picture, but by expressing the horse race number in this way, by highlighting the uncertainty, it does two things. It's more honest about the uncertainty, and also it imposes a discipline in my reporting to actually dial down the horse race in terms of how we present this information to the public. So anyway, it's quite important to us. So, and it's good to be transparent about why we're doing it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good explanation, because there was a lot of people kind of scratching their heads after the last election, as we've kind of referred to. Pete, the next slide we've got here is on leadership attributes for the Prime Minister. Plays politics, if we're going to talk about a horse race, is way out there in front at 73%.
Unfortunately, that's the first time we've put that one in the field, so there's nothing to compare it with.
So can't compare.
But on all the other ratings, the negatives have gone up, the positives have gone down, by close to double figures in a couple of months. So if you look at it, out of touch with ordinary people, which is it's a classic indicator of, whether, people are buying what the guy's selling, up 8 to 59, avoids responsibility up 6, in control of their team. Thank you, Barnaby, down 9. Put in a crisis, which was a real strong point for him right through last year, down 15 to 49.
That's a big drop.
Yeah, trustworthy down 8. I don't think trustworthy is the stock in trade of most pollies, to be honest. 53 down 8, more honest than most politicians. So again, sort of below the meridian, and 9 points off visionary. That all speaks to, the shine, if there was any, at the start of this year after Australia had got through last year, and there was this sense that there'd been a bipartisan effort to do politics differently and listen to the experts, yada, yada. That kind of seems to be wearing off. And I think, for the first time, probably since the bushfires, he appears vulnerable. And I don't know what Katharine thinks. I don't think it helps his constant being locked in quarantine while Albo's going around the marginal seats in regional Queensland, sort of totally free of any constraint, because he hasn't been back home for a couple of weeks.
What do you think, Katharine?
Yeah, we're certainly at a really interesting moment, both in the story of the pandemic and in the story of the sort of political contest of this term. And if you were Scott Morrison, the number you would be most worried about on that attributes was the 15-point plunge in good in a crisis, because getting back to the point we were raising a moment ago, which is that the confidence dividend hasn't sort of transferred across to voting intention, which is strange, but nonetheless true from what we can see in our own data. If you are the Prime Minister, you would hope, though, to be able to bank that confidence dividend at the sharp point in the electoral cycle. That's what we've seen in the state election contests of last year. So if you were the Prime Minister, you would be hoping that by the time you went to the polls, that voters would be viewing you as a positive incumbent in the sense of an incumbent who has competently managed a crisis, as opposed to a destructive incumbent, which is how Americans saw Donald Trump. And obviously Donald Trump is one of the few leaders to lose an election in this COVID cycle, largely because he was perceived to be, a menace in the handling of the pandemic. So, I mean, I don't think people think Scott Morrison is a menace, but that's a very important sort of I don't even know what bank of capital, I suppose, that the Prime Minister would have liked to have at his disposal. Now, of course, the flip side of all of this is that the Prime Minister controls election timing. That's one of the great advantages of incumbency. Now, a bit earlier in the year, I was convinced that the government was setting itself up to go to an election early in October or November. Every sign pointed to that. Obviously, the Prime Minister was saying constantly, I'm not going to do that, but nobody believed that. The Nationals didn't believe it, so they changed the leader. None of us who watch politics for a living believed it either. So, but I think things are now difficult for the government. They're going to remain difficult for some months, because the only way the Prime Minister will start to turn some of this negative sentiment is when the big batches of the Pfizer vaccine arrive and people can, and the vaccination rollout can hit its straps. And the government has very limited control over that. So it's going to be a difficult few months for Scott Morrison. But if the government can right the vaccination rollout in the last quarter of this year, then the Prime Minister can, in effect, sit tight until about May next year and move voters past the memory of this not very lovely time. So, which again, if I sort of pivot back to uncertainty quickly, which has been a bit of a theme in what I've been talking about today, it's sort of, how things look now is not how things are going to look 6 months from now. And we know that because what the pandemic's taught us is that, how things look in this 5 minutes is quite different to how they look in the next 5 minutes. So, I mean, all we can say about this polling, or the insight from the polling, is that it tells us what's going on now. It doesn't tell us what's going to go on by the time the election cycle rolls around next May.
Yeah. So speaking of all the, things changing every 5 minutes, we alluded at the beginning to more than half the country being in lockdown. South Australia's just announced a lockdown from midnight tonight. So shout out to everyone online who's coming to us from lockdown. We've been pretty lucky here in Canberra, but we're thinking of you, and hope it's not going too rough for the moment. We'll go back to the slides now, Pete, and back to the federal government's response to COVID-19. And I believe there's a couple of questions in the chat that you wanted to respond to.
Oh, no, Elizabeth was just asking about that whole, we might be going back over the bones of polling, but I just want to quickly say there was a full review by the sector after the last election. In context, most of the polls were on the edge of margin of error. It wasn't widely out. It was just that it was saying Labor 51-49 rather than the other way around. But out of that, we've established the Australian Polling Council, which is to establish clear methodology and standards and a bit more transparency on the way we go about our business of polling. So, John, I don't know if you'd like to put a link to the Polling Council in the chat. All the major pollers, apart from the new Fairfax 9 mob, have signed up to that. So I don't know if you want to go and look at how we make the omelettes. There's a bit more information out there about it now. It's not omelettes, it's sausages. We can't untangle omelettes, but you know what I'm saying.
But we don't like seeing how the sausage is made.
Oh, we hate the sausage, mate. We like eating it. So it looks, so the federal government they spent a lot of the year, that you got to combine those two numbers, very good, quite good. So we're up in the high 70s. We're down now under 50%. The only shift this week has been over the last couple of weeks, a couple of percent up on very good, and that's dropped off on quite good. So that luster of a combined 70% plus approval is really, really dropped away. If you go to the next slides, though, I think this week it's really a story of states. You can see the huge drop-offs in recognition for the federal government, Victoria, Queensland. WA's done a weird thing this week, but it is a small sample, so it might just be a bit of noise, but they're sort of big, steep slopes that the regard for Canberra has been rolling down. And I think those three states are really interesting because they're Labor states, where the state governments, again, a bit of the luster's gone off, but there is a growing gap between regard for state government and federal government. New South Wales is the messy one because obviously, I'm a Sydney sider. We're in the middle of a self-induced crisis, and the roles of both the federal and the state government are starting to be really felt. As we know, New South Wales thought it was the gold standard up until a few weeks ago. I have tortured a metaphor within inches of its life in today's Guardian, trying to sort of talk about state of origin and how New South Wales thought they were on their way to a clean sweep, but got undone with a bit of hubris. But I'll stick that in the chat if people are interested as well. But I do think these state differences over the next few slides tell a really interesting story. So if you go to the next one, which is the state government response. Now, New South Wales has loved Gladys's work. They've loved it so much they didn't really care when she ended up in ICAC and with all sorts of question marks over the way some eyes have been turned away from things they should have been focused on. But she's dropped down from the high 70s to just over 50. But even in a lockdown, 54%, it's a bit like Andrew's government last year. There was a resilience. Lots of love in Queensland, South Australia, WA still, but those sort of two states, which are both pretty critical to the next election, where the mood is on the decline. And if you're in lockdown, you can see why. But the one I'm really interested in, the one I built my tortured metaphor around, was this, the next slide, which is the speed of the lockdown. So did New South Wales move too fast, too slow, or about the right speed? Now, nationally, 56% think New South Wales moved too slow, but in New South Wales, and John has the full figures, it's 44-44 with
Yep.
So we in New South Wales are still much more likely to be cheering our premier. The rest of the states are going, what's going on, guys? 62% too slowly for the Vics. And that was before they went into lockdown. So we were in the field last week. I suspect those numbers will go up. Likewise, Queensland and South Australia. So it seems to me the other story out of this is that whole federation working together, collaborative, not really griping it with each other. You can see it starting to fray. Palaszczuk has called it the Sydney strain. Daniel Andrews is calling the Prime Minister for New South Wales now. So I do think that we are starting to experience a bit more of a fractious federalism, if I can call it that, and whether or not that leads to more hard borders for longer is probably one of the outputs of that.
Yeah, Katharine, that's there's a pretty stark divide there between people in New South Wales and the other states, I guess, reflecting, just where everyone lives and whether or not New South Wales is going to send their state into lockdown. But just how much is that kind of fracturing, that kind of political truce that we saw emerge last year where we were all in it together, hasn't really lasted that long in the end.
No, well, it's still functioning. The Federation is still functioning. Like, the good news for people who are sort of at home in lockdown watching us in this conversation is the Federation is continuing to function, unlike in some other countries. So we should note that. In terms of though that perception that Pete's talking about, if you guys watching us this lunchtime happened to catch Daniel Andrews' press conference, which was immediately before this conversation, you will have seen manifestations of what Pete was just talking about in terms of that gap. People in New South Wales aren't inclined to, at this point, at least in overwhelming numbers, think that their premier stuffed up. voters outside New South Wales clearly think that Gladys Berejiklian stuffed up, and they can't quite work out why Sydney is doing this half-baked lockdown rather than a proper one. Daniel Andrews sort of surfed in on that sentiment today, and I think with a certain amount of righteous anger, to be frank. He said at one point during the press conference that Victoria, in essence, had locked down last year for Australia, not just for Victoria. That when that big second wave arrived, the Victorians took a bullet is a terrible metaphor, but took on board that sacrifice of locking down and curbing the second wave that could have spread right around the country. So I think what Daniel Andrews was saying this morning is we have some experience in these matters. We know when you have a big outbreak, you need to lock down hard and fast, and you need to see the course. You need to stay the course. So implicit in what the Premier was saying, well, he said a couple of things. He described the situation in Sydney as out of control. That was a quote. And he also made that point that Victoria last year locked down for the country. The implicit question flowing from that is, why is New South Wales now locking down for the country? And of course, the Premier today, the Victorian Premier, had to, basically implemented a hard border with New South Wales. Victorians who are in New South Wales at the moment will not get automatic rights to return home. You will get rights to return on compassionate grounds and some other criteria. So what Andrews was saying was, we don't want to do that, but given people are not locked down in Sydney, we are going to have to lock Sydney out. That's the decision that we're taking. Now, obviously, the Premier is having to announce something that will be very unpopular in Victoria, a week-long extension of the lockdown, possibly longer, and also the most extraordinary step of not allowing Victorians necessarily automatically to return home. So, of course, in the great Federation blame game, blaming Gladys in Sydney is a resort that a Premier would go to in terms of, it's not my fault. It's, we've got a problem in Sydney that's not being managed properly. But I do, just sort of tracking back quickly, I do think that the tone of the Premier's comments really had the ring of righteous anger, that he had done a really hard thing politically last year. He had been smashed by the Commonwealth for doing it, by and large, criticised intently for doing it, also criticised by Berejiklian on occasion for doing it as well. And so when there's an opportunity to turn the tables, I guess the tables get turned.
Yeah. Going back now to the slide. Oh, now I've done it from the start. Sorry, everyone.
While you're looking for it, can I just make one other point, Ebony, that I've been thinking about, and it's probably still a half formed thought, but there was this sense last year that the pandemic was post-ideological. It was just acting on health advice and then doing what needed to be done. You can really see these two, you can see ideology coming back into it, this whole idea of individual responsibility, that you just, in New South Wales, it was you decide if you're an emergency worker or not. You go and get yourself vaccinated. It comes from the feds as well. If you work in aged care, you can't go to work if you don't get vaccinated, rather than a collective systemic response, which is we're all in this together. And it really struck me with the ads that came out last week. Arm yourself. It's very, very individualistic messaging. It's all about you. It's not about us. And if you look at some of the other countries around the world, their ads are much more, we need to get out and the open, the French ads, the Singapore ads, and also those wonderful ones out of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra the other day. So it's interesting. I'm not quite sure where that lands, but it feels to me there are different strains now of the role of the state as the pandemic almost becomes a feature, not a bug of life.
Yeah, and certainly I guess that reflects the base ideological positions of the parties, Labor states being the collective, we're all in it together, and Coalition being the party of do it yourself and get the state out of the way. Pete, we've got here a big jump in people wanting to get vaccinated as soon as possible or being vaccinated. That's good, presumably.
It feels positive, doesn't it?
It does.
3 is on the road. a stubborn 10% who'll never get vaccinated, which is down from 16. And then the people waiting and seeing, who are largely now, I think the next slide will suggest, waiting for Pfizer. So the reason if they're not rushing towards it is that they want the Pfizer, and
Yeah.
the messaging around AstraZeneca has obviously been a real issue. So we've got two issues. We've got supply and we've got hesitancy, and there are a bunch of people that say they will get vaccinated, but they won't get vaccinated until they have a supply of something other than AstraZeneca. So that's kind of the wicked problem that a number of government decisions taken last year are now coming home to roost.
Yeah, and just lastly, we've got this slide on returning to normal, and it seems you haven't polled it before by the looks, but interstate travel allowed without restriction stands out as a clear one that people both, I guess, want and are anticipating. Katharine, how much are those kind of hard border closures between different states, they really mess with people's lives, obviously? It makes sense that I guess that would be a key milestone for people.
Absolutely, and obviously, there's a lot of people in the country who have gone for quite a long time now without seeing relatives from interstate or even really planning to do anything. It's sort of, the optimists and the pessimists, I think, in the country at the moment. All the optimists I know made some dash to have a holiday sort of in the interregnum between the sort of or the arrival of the Delta strain, and all the pessimists I know stayed resolutely at home on the idea that it's not worth doing anything anyway. So it's just a sort of interesting sociological kind of impulse in the country at the moment. But yeah, sure. Look, obviously border closures do genuinely inconvenience people. However, there has been this sort of strange dichotomy in the polling, which Pete and I are aware of, has been there like since the onset of the pandemic. Lockdowns, hard measures have a lot of community support, and that's why they, apart from it being a public health response, it being a thing, that's why the premiers and also the Prime Minister, in terms of the international border, keep going along this path. So we want it to be over, but we're kind of reassured by these closures as well. So it's a tough sort of internally contradictory set of emotions to try and convey to people.
Yeah. So we've got close to 700 people on the line with us today. I'm not sure if we've got a few more because people are stuck at home now and can't go anywhere else, but we appreciate you tuning in nonetheless. We're going to go very shortly to questions from the audience. The first one, John, this one might be for you, is from Linda asking, how many of that 8% are people who will likely be voting for an established independent in the House, so don't particularly care about Labor versus LNP? That's going back to the 2PP plus.
Yeah, I was just looking at Linda's question. I was typing it, but it was turning into a very long message. So I'm trying to draw that up. Those 8% don't actually include the people who say they would vote for an independent or minor party. So we ask a first question of who would you vote for, and people have the opportunity to say, I don't know, I'm undecided. We then ask a second question just to try and push people one way or the other. And again, if they still say, I don't know who I would vote for, that's when they get categorized into the 8%. People who say they would vote for a minor party, Greens, One Nation, or an independent candidate, we then say to them, out of the two, the coalition or Labour, who would you preference? And that's how we arrive at that number, which is the two parties, coalition, Labour and undecided.
Thanks. That was hopefully much more succinct than having to type all that out. And a great question, Linda. It was upvoted, I think, for a reason. The next one's from Kimberly Wheeler. She says, Katharine, if the vaccine rollout gathers momentum later in the year, do you think people will forget quickly and return to support the Prime Minister and his management of it? Or what portion of people are likely to swing on this issue?
Well, this is the $1 million question, isn't it? I wish someone would give me a crystal ball. It would make the next sort of 12 months a lot easier if I could make those predictions. Honestly, I don't know. I think it's sort of the thing is, the longer you hang around in politics, your negatives rise. Basically, the longer you're there, the more people, they get a look at you, they make assessments about you, they make a judgment about you, your negatives rise. And this is, it's just a sort of law of physics in politics, I guess. This government has been strangely brilliant at refreshing itself in the court of public opinion. We've had the Abbott government, the Turnbull government, the Morrison government. Weirdly, even though when Labor went on this cycle of regicide, Labor was very much marked down for it. This has actually been a strategy of the government, a found strategy, but nonetheless a strategy to replenish itself. So it doesn't, strangely, it doesn't feel like a government sort of staggering towards the end of its third term and asking for a fourth, right? It feels as though, I don't know, youth springs eternal somehow. But anyway, I'm just saying that because that's part of the picture. In terms of Morrison and the negatives, well, the last time the Prime Minister fought an election, he had literally been there for 5 minutes in the top job. Now he's been here for a full term where it's been a very high octane term from the bushfires through to this massive global public health crisis, first recession in 30 years. The Prime Minister has been very much front and centre in the public domain during this term. So I suspect voters are starting to get more of a sense of him. And as they get more of a sense of him, his negatives increase. Now, I don't know how the story will end. I genuinely don't. I think it's harder for the Prime Minister to be the new guy at the next election. I think that's impossible. So people will be voting on the government's record. And now we've just got to see whether or not the government can, get this vaccination program back on track, display that competence in the public domain again, and whether or not it can convince people that incumbency matters, that this is the wrong time to change a government because we've got all of these stresses, threats and pressures in the world. I mean, that will clearly be their offering. You can see that is the election the government's limbering up to fight. But I honestly don't know how the story ends.
Hey, you're a veteran pollster. Do people forget?
Look, there is the lap of the goldfish bowl theory that everything seems new when you get up into the heat of an election. I think the challenge, even in the scenario that there is now a vaccine rollout, is this extended lockdown this year, the ability of Labor to ping that to vaccines and quarantines. They're kind of almost being Tony Abbott-esque about it. You only had 2 jobs. If they can land this as we go weeks and weeks and weeks, Canberra accepted, into our roofs and lounge rooms, I think it's hard then to say, oh, well, that's all, it's all over. I also think that this lockdown does have the potential to create more of an economic impact than last year because the government's not pumping as much money in behind it to keep the economy up. And so, again, these mistakes are not consequence-free. And I think they're no longer like last year's mistakes where it was just so unprecedented, we give them a leave pass. We are bottom of the global ladder on vaccine rollout. And even if we manage to limp to the finish line, people ain't going to forget that, and Labor's not going to let people forget that.
Yeah. I suspect that's true. That's what instinct says. And also next year is, the thing is, we're holding up, and slightly in this conversation too, and I apologise for that because I don't mean to, we're holding up the sort of functional vaccine rollout as being some kind of panacea. Now, it's not going to be. It's, sorry to say that. None of us need to hear that at this point in time because we're just slogging on through what feels like the longest siege, but it is not an automatic panacea. So then the task of the next election, if it's held sort of, towards the middle of next year, is for both sides of politics to describe to people what COVID normal looks like and what the consequences of that are. So anyway, look, instinct says, I agree with Pete. My gut feeling is that people won't forget this because it's been pretty profound, but I just think this is a very, very fluid situation, and trying to make predictions is a mug's game.
Yeah, it also makes me wonder which electorates the 35,000 Australians trapped overseas live in. That's quite a substantial number of voters, depending on where they live and if they can get their votes in. I'm sure they won't forget being trapped overseas for months on end in a hurry. The next question is from Anne Jackson, who says the current federal government seems to be quite shameless in their non-responses to the various rorts, sports rorts, car porks. Sorry, I keep calling it car porks. That's a hashtag on Twitter and I just really love it. And Labor has not also been sin-free in terms of discretionary grants and other things. So answer question is, Katharine, short of insurrection, what do the speakers think can be done about calling them to account?
Yes. Oh, insurrection. No. Look, I feel you. I do. I feel you. Yes, it is. I think we may have even discussed this last time we were all together, that there is this sort of strange lack of shame, really, even when called out. There's not much shame and almost zero contrition, which is kind of astonishing. And you are quite right to say that while, or to suggest that while Labor is drawing a lot of attention to this, it's not yet gone a distance along the path to say that actually we'll get rid of all of these discretionary grants programs, which I honestly think that there is the case for that is overwhelming based on the content, like the behaviour of the recent past. It's like, if you basically are not prepared to put programs in place with decent guardrails that at least have a shimmer of merit and public interest, if it's just basically a money pit that everybody just sort of jumps into 5 minutes before an election and sprays stuff in all directions, well, that is an appalling set of circumstances, and that really is the set of circumstances we face. So I do think it is incumbent. I mean, Labor has been substantially better. Let's not both sides it. Labor has been better. They're proposing an integrity commission. They are sort of ponying up to the reining in of discretionary grants programs. The suggestion being that we will actually put guardrails around this. We will put merit-based decision-making back into some of these programs. But, I think we're, well past the point at which, the political class, and I'm not a cynical person at all, but where we can say with some confidence the political class can be trusted in order to, expend these funds in our interest. So,
but we can wring our hands, but the bottom line is it worked. It works. Boondoggling, pork barreling works because we have a cohort of the electorate who are disengaged in politics. They don't trust politicians. They say, well, what are you going to give me? And if you offer me a car park or a new grandstand for my sporting club, that's all that people are offering me. It actually reminds me of John Howard's genius when he was Prime Minister, where people didn't trust government. They didn't want government spending their money. So I'll just send you a direct check, as your dividend for the boom, signed by the Prime Minister. So if people don't believe in government to come up with solutions and programs that make us all collectively better, then they'll take the individual piece. So it's I'm not saying it's not just a disease, that sort of politics. It's also a symptom of the way that politics is seen as being something that doesn't really, affect people.
No, that's fine. And I know obviously voters are transactional like all of us. We all like to go to the shop and buy something nice, or have somebody, send you a nice bunch of flowers that you haven't asked for. I mean, look, absolutely everybody's transactional. That's true. But what's happened though in recent times, and I'm not disputing your landing point, Pete, which is that disengaged voters probably don't care about this stuff, but we can actually track a demonstrable slide in integrity and standards around the management of these programs, and we are at a nadir at the moment. It's not, it is hand wringing. I know I'm a hand wringer from way back, but things are bad at the moment. They are bad. So, and they'll continue to be bad as long as the shamelessness and the lack of remorse continues.
Yeah, and the lack of accountability, but it's the lack of shame that really strikes me. And I thought even seemed to have shocked Katie Gallagher, the former chief minister and senator who's in charge of, the COVID scrutiny committee that kind of had this discussion with the auditor yesterday. And just, I thought she came across on Fran this morning as kind of palpably shocked that there wasn't even a pretense towards criteria for the car parks, slush fund, essentially, that it was just like, no, give us your demands and we'll fund them. There was not even at
least in sports grants, there was a pretense of a process.
Yeah.
Like there was, I mean, it wasn't just, nominate your girls change block and we'll ticket. I mean, a fair bit of that went on. But it was actually difficult to execute it because there were guidelines in the program. This is no guidelines. This is just, how's your father? Bowl up with whatever thought bubble you've got. Here's the cash. And it's like that. That's what I'm saying in terms of, while agreeing with Pete's general diagnostic, which is politics is transactional. I think we've got some really troubling warning signs here about what's going on, and I hope that somehow that can penetrate the consciousness of it. If
kind of following on from this, the question from Neil Victor Hudson is that Josh Frydenberg has been caught up in the car park rorts scandal, and his question is, why on earth would he, in an ultra safe seat, even bother to involve himself in this kind of
I think Jill's answered it underneath, actually, Ebony. They were worried last time with Burnside. The Greens had a crack. I think GetUp was quite active in his seat. And, there was this sort of grand map of the shortened slide where these seats would fall, and there would be this blossoming of blue-green seats across the wealthier suburbs of Melbourne, which never sort of came to pass.
It was a delusion, but
totally.
But that's Pete's pinged the point there, which sort of answers the question, the why in that question. Well, what the car parks program tells us is that the coalition were worried about safe seats, and like Frydenberg's, like Michael Sukar's, the person who had backed Peter Dutton in the leadership contest, and was Labor had a good candidate up against him. That it tells us something interesting about the dynamics of the last federal election if you read that audit report closely.
Hey, Katharine, can I ask you a question? If Morrison runs a replay of his last election campaign, just going around with his baseball cap announcing this sort of stuff, will he get away with it from the media this time, given everything we know now? Or is he lost permission to play the trick again?
No, but I think it's sort of like that's like, I'm looking at the time that requires such a substantial conversation in order to answer that question. I think it's we can tie an answer back to the polling. I think a dynamic that is absent in the current political contest is this overwhelming sense that Labor are the favourites, that they, the dynamic that went off the rails in the last federal election and through much of the last parliamentary term was in fact poll driven, that there was this sense that Labor was a government in exile, and they were treated as a government. They were the favourites. They'd won every poll since Malcolm Turnbull almost lost the election. They won every poll in that parliamentary term, and they were ahead in the polling during the election as well. So they were treated by the media as the incipient government, as it were. They faced a lot more scrutiny. Everybody, apart from Morrison, thought the coalition was going to lose. Now that cycle does not exist in the current political contest, partly because of decisions, that you made and I made about, false flags and dialing down the horse race. At the moment, I think if you asked most voters in the country who's going to win the next election, they would say Morrison, and they would be surprised if you told them that Labor was actually level pegging in the polls. So that dynamic won't exist at the next federal election. But whether or not Morrison does the same retail as he did in the last one, and whether or not that works, I don't know the answer to that question.
The next question is on a topic close to your heart, Katharine, on climate change. Jared asks, how much influence do you feel that the carbon border adjustment mechanism threat from the EU will have on the coalition's energy, in brackets, fossil fuel and gas-led recovery program?
The CBAMs, yes. Well, it is certainly focusing minds. There's no doubt about that. I mean, part of the sort of underpinnings of Scott Morrison's tentative sort of with a million underpants on it pivot on climate change is the sort of external, just call it external pressure. So pressure from allies, Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, the Europeans in terms of positioning on carbon border adjustments. We want to negotiate a free trade deal with the EU. It's the largest trading bloc, or, I don't know actually if it's still the largest trading bloc in the world, but it's a big one. It's far more important free trade agreement for Australia than the British FTA was, for example. So I think certainly our policymakers are cognizant of the international conditions, but the biggest barrier to entry remains internal sentiment in the coalition. The national party's completely off the long run. Again, this is sorry to not be able to answer any of these sort of substantive and utterly reasonable questions today about how is this going to play out? What does the future hold? I don't really know how the story ends, but I think, Morrison is weighted by problems on either side. He's got all this international pressure across a range of fronts, then he's got the colleagues, and we've seen, and conditions can get very dangerous for prime ministers when they're sort of caught between two very difficult propositions like that.
I was really struck by Barnaby Joyce asking, as the Deputy Prime Minister, where's the plan for 2050 when they've been in government since, 2014? They're in charge of the plan. There still isn't one. The next question, again, I'll exercise my prerogative as host, is from Annette Brownie, and she's asking, do you think the Australia Institute poll showing 47% of both Australians and Taiwanese people believe that China is a direct threat is part of the process to keep Australians afraid to the benefit of election outcomes? So just for everyone else's benefit, that was polling that we did in the wake of, I guess, a number of ministers and senior government official types kind of beating the drums of war, really talking up the threat from China. And we wanted to see, what the public attitudes were to that perceived threat and compare it to, Taiwan, which is right next to China, has lived for a long time with a very aggressive China on its doorstep. Basically the poll found that there was pretty equal perceptions of threat and the aggressiveness of China. But how much do you think, Katharine, that beating the drums of war type of rhetoric is seeping into the public there?
Yeah, well, it's certainly part of the election story that the coalition is setting up to tell. It's sort of, even if we reduce, if we take China out of the equation in terms of naming China, particularly, it's sort of like you can sort of see the election conversation that's being set up is the uncertainty of the times, both geostrategic, international, local. Pandemic is still with us. These are difficult times. Back the horse, or whatever was that Reagan? I can't remember who. Don't change horses in midstream. Someone had that anyway. Whatever. You can see that's where the coalition's going. In terms of the China and Australians' attitudes, if you look at any poll at all at the moment, you can see that domestic attitudes towards China have darkened over the last few years, and that's rational because obviously it's an autocratic country with ambitions to be is a great power of the century and wants to expand that power. It has a very different system to Australia. So you can understand why people are increasingly anxious about China and its ambitions. So look, I think it'll feature. I do think it'll feature, but then, you know, whether it sways people fundamentally or whether their interests are more retail in terms of, you know, it's again, it's a bit soon to say, but it's certainly part of call it the, you know, it's sort of like scenery on a stage. It's kind of like, it's like set design. It's part of the coalition set design.
Yeah, can I just say though, in terms of the broader setup of where we're going politically, we know that lockdowns and border, like I think there is a natural recoil to globalization happening anyway. I think the Conservatives may try to use it, but they're also going to be mindful of their economic position, which is much more open than Labor. So I think it's going to take really skillful handling to be able to come up with propositions that work for you politically, but also allow you to govern if you get to the end of that journey. And I think the handling of China is just such a high risk strategy politically that, yes, Peter Dutton probably has a path line to victory where a lot more of us are wearing khaki, but I'm just not sure if the rest of his team is up for that yet.
Yeah, I might indulge myself one last time and show another slide from the Australia Institute this time, which is the poll that Katharine referred to earlier this week that we released. Just showing we've been tracking over the last year, really since the start of the pandemic, which level of government people feel is doing better with the pandemic. And as you can see over the last couple of months, it's crystallized quite a bit there. So the federal government, not many people out there really thinking they're doing a better job than the states, and the number thinking both are doing an equally good job has been dropping as well, and really seeing, I guess, the role of the state governments there coming to the fore. Just an interesting one. You can find that, I think, on our website if you head on over there. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We've touched on quite a bit. I think there's links in the chat to things like the polling council. I want to thank Pete and Katharine for that explanation of the two-party preferred plus, because there's a very good reason, as you said, that after the last election, Essential and Guardian looked at this new model, and I think it does help remove a lot of that certainty that everyone had with the polling results from last time. Thanks everyone for your questions. As always, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. And as I said, thank you so much everyone for attending. We had close to 700 people online with us today. We do poll position fortnightly along with the release of the Guardian Essential poll. So please tune in again. You can sign up online for multiple ones at once. Don't forget, we've got Rex Patrick tomorrow talking about how to keep the bastards honest. We'll touch on FOI laws, his court case around whether national cabinet is a national cabinet, whether or not we need constitutional amendments to help us keep the government more accountable and things like that. So it should be a good one. Thank you to John, Katharine and Pete again for joining us on this panel, and stay safe out there. Thoughts with everyone in lockdown. Stay safe, wash hands, wear a mask, stay at home if you can. We've got to get through to the other side of this, and feels like we're in for the long haul at the moment. So thoughts are with everyone in lockdown. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks, if not tomorrow. Thanks. Bye, everyone.